Harlem in the late 1930s did not sleep the way other neighborhoods slept. It breathed. It listened. It remembered. The storefronts along Lenox Avenue glowed amber beneath iron street lamps, their windows reflecting not only jazz and laughter, but the fragile dignity of a community that had learned to survive inside systems not built for its survival. White tablecloth restaurants stood beside cramped apartments. Pianists played songs that felt like confessionals. And beneath the rhythm of music and business and whispered negotiation, there was something else, a quiet tension that had never fully disappeared. At the center of that tension stood Bumpy Johnson. He was not loud. He did not wave authority. Like a banner, he walked with the composure of a man who understood both poetry and pressure. His mind worked several moves ahead of anyone speaking to him, and yet he listened more than he spoke. Those who underestimated him often mistook his silence for passivity. They learned quickly that silence in his hands was precision. Years earlier, when Harlem had been squeezed by outside interests that viewed it merely as territory rather than community, Bumpy had chosen negotiation over chaos. He had endured humiliation in certain rooms so that his people would not endure worse in others. He had studied the temperaments of men who believed power came from force alone and had realized something they did not, that permanence belongs to those who think long-term. But even permanent structures can fracture from within. It began with whispers, documents shown to the wrong eyes, meetings interrupted by officials who arrived too informed, deals stalled not by accident, but by precision timing. Bumpy noticed patterns. He always noticed patterns. And then there was Clarence Whitmore. Clarence had grown up 2 blocks from where he now wore polished shoes. He had once stood in a barber shop debating politics and reciting lines from Shakespeare, believing himself destined for something larger than the blocks that raised him. Bumpy had seen potential in him, intelligence, ambition, hunger. He had given him access. Access to rooms where strategies were crafted. Access to trust. Trust is not extended lightly in Harlem. It is earned over years, reinforced through shared risk, and protected fiercely. Clarence knew this. That was why his betrayal cut deeper than business. The pressure that bent him did not arrive in the form of a threat screamed across a table. It came quietly, invitations to dinners downtown, conversations with men who wore tailored suits and polite smiles while discussing order. They spoke of stability, of progress, of the importance of cooperation. They framed Harlem as a place that needed supervision. Clarence, flattered by their attention, began to believe he was indispensable. They convinced him that feeding information was not betrayal, it was modernization. They convinced him that aligning himself with power meant becoming power. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to talk. He did not shout secrets into the street. He leaked them delicately, enough to shift advantage, enough to embarrass Bumpy in negotiation, enough to create the impression that Harlem's leadership was fragmented. When authorities suddenly disrupted a carefully balanced agreement one night, Bumpy did not explode. He adjusted his cufflinks, finished his drink, and left the table without protest. But in his mind, a calculation had begun. The injustice was not merely economic. It was existential. The humiliation of Harlem's businessmen in front of outside brokers sent a message that they could be manipulated, that their unity was illusion. That message could not stand. Within weeks, Clarence disappeared. He did not flee dramatically. He accepted a position out of state, one presented by the same men who had praised his cooperation. He left behind a neighborhood that had once toasted him and convinced himself he had transcended it. Bumpy never pursued him. That decision confused many. Some expected retaliation. Some expected public condemnation. Instead, Bumpy tightened internal structures. He refined protocols. He rebuilt alliances. He studied where information had slipped and reinforced the walls quietly. He also began something few noticed. He began visiting barbershops. Again, barbershops in Harlem were not merely for grooming. They were sanctuaries, confessionals, forums. Under the steady glide of a razor across skin, men spoke honestly. Bumpy would sit in the corner chair, reading poetry while listening to conversation drift around him. He understood something profound. A community survives not because it wins every battle, but because it retains its dignity. After losing 11 years passed, Harlem evolved. Businesses flourished cautiously. Jazz matured. A generation that had watched humiliation slowly began to experience stability. And then, one winter evening, Clarence returned. He arrived not as the uncertain young man who once sought validation, but as someone who believed time had erased memory. His suit was expensive, his shoes immaculate. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who assumed he had outgrown his origin. But Harlem does not forget. He chose a restaurant that symbolized progress: white linen, polished silver, low chandeliers casting amber light. He requested Table 7. The number was coincidence to him, that it was not coincidence to Bumpy. 11 years earlier, at that same table, Clarence had nodded subtly while outsiders dissected Harlem's position. At that same table, he had justified his silence while disrespect unfolded. When word reached Bumpy that Clarence was back, and where he was seated, he did not rush. He finished his tea. He closed the book in his lap. He adjusted his tie. He walked into the restaurant alone. The room shifted without anyone announcing why. Bumpy greeted the owner warmly, asked about his family, complimented the pianist. He moved through this space like a man attending a celebration. But as former allies separated by choice, Bumpy pulled out the empty chair and sat. Silence gathered. 11 years, Bumpy said gently, as though discussing weather. Time has a way of clarifying things. Clarence attempted composure. He spoke of opportunity, of misunderstandings, of survival. He framed his past actions as necessary evolution. Bumpy listened. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He simply allowed the weight of the room to settle around them. On the table sat a folded straight razor, decorative, part of the restaurant's nod to Harlem's barbershop heritage. Bumpy reached for it slowly. The room tightened. But he did not open it. He turned it in his hand thoughtfully, then laid it flat against the tablecloth. In Harlem, he said quietly, a razor is used to clean a man up before he steps into the world, not to cut him down behind his back. The words were not loud, but they carried. Clarence's composure cracked, not from fear, but from recognition. The symbolism was unmistakable. The razor represented choice. It represented refinement. It represented preparation. It also represented accountability. Bumpy stood. He signaled the waiter and requested the bill for every table in the restaurant. Murmurs rippled through the room. When the check arrived, he paid it without flourish. Then, he addressed Clarence one final time. You thought distance would protect you, he said. But distance only tests whether you remember who you are. He placed his hat on his head and walked toward the exit. No threats. No violence. No spectacle. Just restoration of balance. The pianist resumed playing. And Clarence sat alone at table 7, staring at a razor he now understood was never meant for blood, but for clarity. Outside, snow began to fall over Harlem. And inside, something deeper than revenge had taken place. Respect had been reclaimed. Snow did not soften Harlem. But beneath that fragile calm lay something unsettled. Word had spread before the sun rose. Not exaggerated, not distorted, simply told. He had reminded him who he was, and that was far more dangerous. Because humiliation fades. Violence fades. But reflection lingers. Clarence Whitmore did not leave Harlem the next morning as he once had. Pride would not allow it. He told himself that Bumpy's gesture had been theater, a display meant to reaffirm hierarchy. He told himself That men like Bumpy thrived on symbolism, and that he, Clarence, had evolved beyond that old neighborhood morality. Yet something in his chest felt different now. It was not fear. It was exposure. For 11 years, he had convinced himself that betrayal was strategy. Now Harlem had held up a mirror without raising a hand. Meanwhile, Bumpy did what he always did after significant moments. He returned to routine. Routine was power. He visited the barber shop on 7th Avenue just after noon, the same shop where men debated philosophy between razor strokes. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, and conversation paused only briefly before resuming. He removed his hat, nodded respectfully to the elders seated along the wall, and took the corner chair. "Cold morning," the barber said. "Clear." "Morning," Bumpy replied. The distinction mattered. The barber draped the cloth across Bumpy's shoulders and began preparing the razor. Its metallic shine caught the light, deliberate and precise. Bumpy closed his eyes not in sleep, but in reflection. He was not thinking about Clarence. He was thinking about consequence, because Clarence's return was not coincidence. Men rarely return to the place of their betrayal unless they believe the climate has changed in their favor. And Harlem's growing stability had begun attracting outside interest once again. Contracts, developments, investments, conversations, whispered in back offices downtown about redevelopment and control. Bumpy had seen this cycle before, years earlier, in negotiations shadowed by figures like Dutch Schultz. He had learned how fragile balance could be when powerful men decided they were entitled to more. He had survived those years not by aggression, but by strategy. He had preserved Harlem's voice in rooms where it was often dismissed. Now, back into the street after his shave, snow crunched beneath polished shoes. Across the avenue, a black sedan idled longer than necessary. He did not turn his head toward it. He did not need to. Harlem's survival had always depended on awareness without panic. That evening, Clarence hosted a quiet dinner at the same restaurant. Though he avoided Table 7, he invited investors from outside neighborhoods, men who viewed Harlem's growth as opportunity rather than heritage. They spoke in smooth language about modernizing infrastructure and streamlining leadership. Clarence listened carefully, offering subtle assurances that Harlem's internal unity was less solid than it appeared. He had not learned the lesson. He was attempting once more to leverage perception, but Harlem had changed. One of the waiters at that dinner was the nephew of a barber who shaved Bumpy earlier that day. Conversations travel faster than cars in tight communities. By nightfall, Bumpy knew of the dinner, the investors, the phrases being used. Still, he did not intervene. Instead, he did something that puzzled even his closest confidants. He requested a meeting, not with Clarence, but with the restaurant owner. They met privately in the back office. The owner was anxious, unsure whether the tension surrounding his establishment would damage its reputation. Bumpy reassured him calmly. "No one will disturb your business," Bumpy said. "Not from inside, not from outside." The owner swallowed. "But they're talking about new contracts, new oversight." Bumpy folded his hands. "Oversight only exists where confidence is weak. Strengthen confidence." "How?" Bumpy stood and walked toward the window overlooking Lenox Avenue. "Invite the pastors. Invite the musicians. Let them see each other. Let them speak openly." The owner blinked. "That's not what I expected." Bumpy turned slightly. "You expected me to shut something down. I prefer to build something stronger. A visible affirmation of unity, no secrets." He assumed it was either arrogance or ignorance. It was neither. The night of the dinner arrived heavy with anticipation. Snow had melted, leaving the streets slick and reflective. The restaurant filled beyond capacity. Laughter mingled with cautious curiosity. Clarence entered late. He noticed that no one avoided him, but no one embraced him either. They watched. Bumpy stood near the center of the room, not elevated, not spotlighted, simply present. When the room quieted, he spoke without raising his voice. "Harlem has been spoken about for decades," he began. "Tonight, let's speak for ourselves." No accusations followed. No references to betrayal. He invited business owners to share challenges openly. He asked pastors about community needs. He asked musicians what they required to thrive. Room shifted from suspicion to participation. Clarence felt something unfamiliar, irrelevance. He had returned believing leverage was his weapon. But leverage requires secrecy. And Bumpy had dissolved secrecy in one evening. Midway through the gathering, Clarence stood to speak. His voice carried confidence, but beneath it lay urgency. "We can't ignore opportunity," he said. "Outside. Investment can elevate Harlem beyond these blocks. We need partnerships." Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. "Partnership requires equality." "Of course." "And equality requires transparency." Clarence hesitated. "Naturally." "Then let every partnership be discussed in rooms like this," Bumpy said gently. "With the people who live here." The room responded not with applause, but with steady agreement. Clarence realized the trap, not one of hostility, but of accountability. Any maneuver he attempted would now unfold. Under public scrutiny, the power dynamic had shifted again. But the most powerful moment came later. As plates were cleared, and conversation softened, Bumpy approached Clarence privately near the coat rack. "You're intelligent," Bumpy said quietly. "You could build here. Instead, you're trying to bypass." Clarence stiffened. "I'm trying to modernize." "Modernize without erasing," Bumpy replied. "There's a difference." For a brief second, something cracked in Clarence's composure. 11 years ago, he had sought validation from men who never truly respected him. Clarence said, "I didn't need to." Bumpy answered. The silence between them held more weight than confrontation ever could. Outside, a crowd lingered on the sidewalk, discussing the evening. For the first time since Clarence's return, there was no whisper of division, only debate, open and visible. The black sedan that once idled across the street drove away unnoticed. Because there was nothing to exploit. As Bumpy stepped into the cold night air, he felt no triumph. Only confirmation. Harlem's strength was not in retaliation. It was in unity made visible. Behind him, through the restaurant window, Clarence remained standing alone for a moment, staring at the long table where business owners now exchanged ideas freely. The razor at table 7 had never been opened. It had not needed to be. The real cut had been made quietly through exposure, through transparency, through dignity reclaimed. And the ghost that believed it had escaped Harlem began to understand that Harlem had never truly released him. Harlem had learned how to survive noise. What it had not yet mastered was surviving. Silence. In the weeks following the community dinner, something shifted beyond the visible harmony. Investors who once spoke boldly began postponing meetings. Letters went unanswered. Invitations were rescinded with polite excuses. On the surface, it appeared as though outside interests had simply lost momentum. But Bumpy Johnson knew better. Silence from powerful men was rarely retreat. It was recalculation. He stood one evening on a rooftop overlooking Lenox Avenue, coat collar turned up against the wind, watching lights flicker across the neighborhood like signals in the dark. Harlem was alive beneath him, children running past storefronts, couples stepping into jazz clubs, elders seated by windows speaking softly about a world that had never fully included them. Every flicker represented someone who had endured more than they were given credit for. That was what Clarence had misunderstood. Harlem was not a territory. It was memory. Down below, Clarence walked those same sidewalks, but his steps were heavier now. The unity he had hoped to fracture had strengthened instead. Investors who once whispered promises into his ear had grown distant. They had not withdrawn entirely. They had simply shifted their approach, and that shift was coming. The first sign arrived in the form of a newspaper headline. The article did not accuse directly. Instead, It questioned community leadership structures in Harlem. It suggested inefficiencies. It implied the need for oversight. The language was elegant. The intention was not. Bumpy read the paper in the corner of a cafe, expression unchanged. He folded it carefully and placed it beside his coffee. "Storm coming?" the owner asked quietly. "Storm's already here," Bumpy replied. "We just haven't felt the rain." That afternoon, city officials announced a proposed redevelopment. Commission and Advisory Board to modernize Harlem's commercial district. The members? All from outside the neighborhood. And Clarence Whitmore's name appeared at the bottom as a consulting liaison. Clarence hadn't expected that. He had attended a private meeting 2 nights earlier, believing he was negotiating balanced terms. Instead, his name had been used attached without full disclosure, positioned as proof of local cooperation. He realized too late what had happened. They had used him again, this time. However, Harlem was watching. By sunset, murmurs rippled through storefronts and brownstones. Or had he been maneuvered? The distinction mattered less than the perception. And perception was power. Bumpy did not call a meeting. He walked into the largest ballroom in Harlem that evening, the Renaissance Ballroom where musicians rehearsed. Some demanded confrontation. Others feared city retaliation. A few suggested compromise. Bumpy stood quietly at the center. He allowed every voice to speak first. Then, when silence returned, he addressed them not as a commander, but as a custodian. "They want division," he said evenly. "They want us arguing about Clarence instead of questioning the commission. Yes, and he may have again. But tonight isn't about him." The power of that sentence settled deeply. He did not defend Clarence. He did not condemn him. He redirected focus. "That commission will meet in 3 nights, Bumpy continued. "Someone asked because we'll be there," he answered. Not in protest. Harlem arrived, shop owners in pressed suits, ministers carrying Bibles. Officials greeted him politely, but their smiles were thinner now. They sensed unrest. When Bumpy entered, there was no spectacle. He removed his hat respectfully and took a seat in the front row. The commission chairman began reading prepared statements about strategic oversight and economic alignment. Halfway through, Bumpy stood. He did not shout. He requested recognition calmly. After a pause, he was granted the floor. "Gentlemen," he began, voice steady and resonant, "oversight suggests deficiency. Before you oversee Harlem, perhaps you should first listen to Harlem." A murmur of agreement rose behind him. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the crowd. "These business owners have balanced books through depression. These musicians have filled halls without subsidy." He looked back at the chairman. "Tell me specifically, where is the deficiency?" The room shifted. The chairman adjusted his papers. "This is a procedural matter. Procedure without participation breeds resentment," Bumpy replied gently. He then did something unexpected. He turned toward Clarence. "Mr. Whitmore," he said evenly, "as liaison, perhaps you can clarify how this commission benefits the people standing behind you." Every eye turned. Clarence's heart pounded louder than the murmurs. For a split second, he considered deflection. He considered repeating rehearsed phrases. Instead, he looked into the faces of the people he once grew up beside. He saw not hostility, but expectation. He swallowed. "This proposal," Clarence began, slowly, "does not currently include formal representation from Harlem's Business Council." A ripple passed through the room, and without that representation, "Mr. Whitmore, you agreed." "I agreed to consultation," Clarence interrupted, surprising even himself. "Not substitution." Silence fell like gravity. For the first time in 11 years, Clarence chose Harlem publicly. The commission adjourned abruptly. No vote. No resolution. Outside City Hall, snow began falling again, just as it had the night at Table 7. Harlem gathered on the steps, not cheering, not celebrating, but standing together. Bumpy approached Clarence slowly. You had a choice. Bumpy studied him carefully. Tonight, you withdrew it. The words were not praise. They were acknowledgement. In that moment, redemption did not arrive as applause. It arrived as inclusion. The black sedan that once idled on Lenox Avenue was nowhere in sight. Because division had failed. But the night held one more twist. As Bumpy and Clarence walked down the steps together, a reporter pushed through the crowd, thrusting a notepad forward. Mr. Johnson, he called, are you declaring control over Harlem's economic future? Bumpy paused beneath the falling snow. I don't control Harlem, he answered calmly. The reporter lowered his pen. And in that simple sentence, the narrative shifted. The razor had remained closed, yet something sharper than steel had cut through manipulation. Accountability. The city had expected conflict. Instead, it witnessed unity. And for the first time in 11 years, downtown, offices that once whispered strategy now spoke in sharper tones. Phone calls were made. Favors were called in. Influence was recalibrated, because power that fails publicly does not. Began visiting Harlem businesses with unusual frequency. Permits were delayed for no stated reason. The language was bureaucratic, the intention unmistakable. Pressure. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was suffocating. Shop owners, who had stood proudly at City Hall, now faced fines they could barely afford. Musicians found venues temporarily under review. A pastor received notice that his building's structural code required immediate compliance upgrades. The message was clear. Unity would cost them. And this time, there would be no public commission to confront, only paperwork. Harlem felt it immediately. Conversations that once rang with optimism turned cautious. For the first time since his return, Clarence understood the depth of what Bumpy had carried for years. Leadership was not about defiance. Instead, he did something unexpected. He called for a scholarship dinner. Not a protest, not a rally, a scholarship. The announcement surprised even his closest associates. At a time when Harlem faced audits and pressure, Bumpy proposed raising funds for young students, future lawyers, accountants, architects. Why now? They worried about tomorrow's inspections. They worried about quiet retaliation. Clarence stood near the entrance, watching as families entered with cautious hope. He approached Bumpy before the event began. This pressure, Clarence said softly, it's because of me. No, he replied calmly. They don't have to, Bumpy answered. We only need to endure. The dinner began without spectacle. Stories of students who dreamed of representing Harlem in courts and corporations replaced talk of audits and commissions. Then, midway through dessert, a city official entered the ballroom. Uninvited. The room. He began smoothly. We must address ongoing compliance concerns. Several businesses represented here are under investigation. Continued non-cooperation could result in license suspensions. The implication hung heavy. Cooperate or lose everything. All eyes turned to Bumpy. The official expected defiance. He expected confrontation. Instead, Bumpy stepped forward calmly. Thank you for attending, he said evenly. We appreciate transparency. The official blinked, slightly disarmed. Bumpy continued, voice steady and deliberate. If any business here is found in violation of legitimate codes, we will comply. Harlem does not fear lawful standards. What we reject is selective enforcement. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the crowd. He then turned toward the audience. Tonight is about our children. If oversight concerns exist, we will address them tomorrow. The official shifted uncomfortably. Are you refusing cooperation? He pressed. I am refusing intimidation. Interrupting a scholarship dinner painted him not as authority, he said curtly before exiting. The doors closed behind him. The ballroom exhaled collectively. He had not threatened. He had reframed the confrontation entirely. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and chairs were stacked, Clarence approached him again. I used to think power meant sitting at the table with them, Clarence admitted. Bumpy regarded him carefully. Power means deciding which table matters. Outside, snow began falling once more, as though Harlem's winters carried memory. But the true climax had yet to arrive. 2 days later, an anonymous letter surfaced in the press alleging financial improprieties tied to Harlem's business council. It did not name Bumpy directly, but it implied corruption. The strategy was clear: discredit the symbol. The neighborhood braced for impact. Reporters gathered near storefronts. Officials hinted at investigations. Even some allies grew nervous. Clarence came to Bumpy that evening with urgency in his voice. "They're preparing a formal inquiry," he said. "If they move fast enough, perception alone could destroy credibility." Bumpy sat behind his desk, reading the letter quietly. "Who benefits from this?" he asked calmly. "Those who want oversight." "And who authored it?" Clarence hesitated. "The language, it resembles documentation I once drafted." The confession hung between them, Clarence's old templates, his old phrasing, his old influence. "They're using my past to frame the present," he said quietly. Bumpy looked up at him. "Then, the only antidote is truth." The following morning, instead of hiding, Bumpy did something no one expected. He requested a public audit of every business tied to the council. Voluntary, open, transparent. The announcement stunned both allies and adversaries. Why invite scrutiny? Because transparency dissolves suspicion. The audit unfolded publicly over weeks. Account books were opened, transactions reviewed, compliance verified, and when the results were published, they revealed no corruption. None. The anonymous letter lost its teeth. The officials who had anticipated scandal were left exposed in their overreach. But the most powerful moment came quietly, one evening. As the final audit report was delivered, Clarence stood beside Bumpy in the office overlooking Lenox Avenue. "It's over," Clarence said softly. Bumpy shook his head. "No," he replied. "It's balanced." Clarence studied him. "You could have destroyed me 11 years ago." "Yes." "You could have humiliated me at table 7. "Yes." "You could have blamed me for this." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Bumpy walked toward the window, looking down at Harlem illuminated beneath streetlights. "Because a man who learns is more valuable than a man who falls." Clarence felt something shift deep inside him, heavier than guilt, lighter than shame. Responsibility. Outside, children laughed in the snow. Inside, silence carried not tension, but closure. Harlem had endured humiliation, division, audits, accusations, and it had answered every attempt not with retaliation, but with dignity. The razor at table 7 had never been open. It had never needed to be. The sharpest edge in Harlem was not steel. It was character. Weeks later, as spring began, replacing snow, a small plaque was installed in the ballroom honoring scholarship recipients. At the bottom of the plaque were simple words: "Respect cannot be taken. It can only be upheld." Bumpy stood before it quietly, not as ruler, not as legend, but as custodian. And Clarence stood beside him, not as betrayer, but as witness to what quiet power truly meant. The city moved on. Commissions dissolved. Audits ended. Newspapers found new headlines. But Harlem remembered. It remembered the night at table 7. It remembered the steps of City Hall. It remembered the scholarship dinner. And it remembered that true strength is not proven by how loudly a man fights, but by how steadily he stands. Under a fading sunset on Lenox Avenue, Bumpy Johnson adjusted his hat and walked forward into the rhythm of Harlem once more, not victorious, not triumphant, simply unwavering. And in that unwavering presence, justice found its voice.